going to see some very wonderful lessons from this section of Jacob's life. We're going to be focusing not just on Jacob here in this final study for today, but also on Leah. And we will learn a very great lesson from Leah in the process. Well, did you read there in Genesis chapter 30 what it was like in Jacob's house? You know, he ends up with 4 wives. One is quite adequate, brethren, I think. And one was meant to be by God from the beginning. But he's got 4. So he gets Leah, he waits a week, gets Rachel, has to work another 7 years for her. But in the course of what then follows, he ends up with the 2 handmaids as well. 4 wives. What was it like in that family? Now, towards the end of our last study, we asked you to start creating some pictures in your mind. I want you to start doing that again. You know, we're all capable of doing that, aren't we? Imagining something from what we read. I want you to just read with me Genesis chapter 30 and verse 8. So when Bilhah conceives again, this is what Rachel says. With great wrestlings have I wrestled with my sister, and I have prevailed. She called his name Naphtali, my wrestlings. Okay, now, when you look at the Hebrew words that are used here, the word great is actually Elohim. Yeah, it's Elohim. So, Rotherham translates it, with the wrestlings of God. I have wrestled with my sister. Well, she was wrong, of course, because had Jacob followed divine providence through the workings of the angels, he wouldn't have had 2 and then 4 wives. And there wouldn't have been this wrestling going on in his family. But there was intense struggle. Now, just get a picture of that. You know, all of us brethren have only got 1 wife. Most of us have a reasonably happy marriage. Sometimes, of course, it's otherwise, but most of it's a happy marriage. Now, imagine if you had 4 wives and they spend the whole time fighting. Fighting over many things, including who you will go into that night. And that's what happens here. Jacob ends up being, as a bit of horse trading goes on, he ends up being sort of like raffled as to who he will go into that night. What an appalling situation that is. Little wonder we can describe it as a fractious family. You've heard about fracking, have you? Well, I know there's a lot of people disturbed in North America about fracking. It's where you have, you know, they put charges downstairs and blow things up. And of course it produces all kinds of problems. Wealth for the wealthy, but problems for the ordinary folk. So, Fractious family is a family divided, arguing, fighting, broken up. Not a very nice place to be, which is why I believe Jacob spends a lot of his time outside the house. You know, he talks later on to Laban about how he spent long nights outside in the field. Yeah, I think I might have been out there with him if I'd been in his situation. So this is the family we've got. Now, how would you operate in that environment, brethren and sisters, particularly sisters? If you're one of the 4, how would you operate in that? Well, we're going to talk about the story of Leah. Now, here are the sons of Jacob, and you're all familiar with the family of Jacob. He has 12 sons. He could have got all 12 from Leah, all of them, if he just believed that God was at work in his life. He doesn't believe, and this is where he ends up, with a fractious family. Reuben, when they came back to the land, he was about 32 at the birth of Benjamin. Now, I'm going to go into some proofs later on as to the ages, you know, the time that Jacob spends in Haran. But we'll leave that until tomorrow, God willing. So, Reuben was about 32 when they came back into the land, Levi about 31 and 30 and so on. And Joseph was still a young boy, really. He might have been close to his teens, but he was still a young boy. So here's the family of Jacob. And there's a lot of trouble that's gone on to produce those 12 sons and the daughter, I can tell you. And that's the record of Genesis 29 and 30. So let's pick up the record at verse 31, maybe where we began to read. Verse 30. of Genesis 29 says this, "And he went in also unto Rachel, and he loved also Rachel more than Leah, and served with him yet 7 other years." So if you're Leah, you've been shut out. You do not have Jacob's affections. He shows his affection for Rachel, and I don't need to go into explanations about what would have happened. You were shut out largely from the marital bed, but when her turn came, she conceived. Look at verse 31. "And when Yahweh saw that Leah was hated," now the word hated here doesn't mean hate in the sense that we understand the English word to mean. It has more of the idea of not preferred. So she was not preferred. She was second in line, so to speak, a distant second to Rachel in Jacob's affections, if he in fact felt any affection for Leah at all. But he went into her. He did the right thing. It was a conjugal obligation. And so what happens in verse 31, that when God sees that she's not preferred, he opens her womb. But Rachel was barren. So God gets involved. And Leah knows this. She knows this. And in verse 32 we read, "Leah conceived and bare a son, and she called his name Reuben. For she said, Surely Yahweh hath looked upon my affliction. Now therefore my husband will love me." Wrong. It didn't turn out that way. But you see, this is like a victory cry. She recognises Yahweh's intervention on her behalf. Rachel's barren. She knows that God's at work in her life and to bring forth Jacob's sons. But she thinks that this first son is going to change Jacob's mind. That all of a sudden, the light's going to come on in Jacob's brain. He's going to wake up to himself. The idiot. He made a mistake. He should have just accepted Leah. All 12 boys could come from her. She thinks that Jacob's going to change his mind. It doesn't happen. And she's bitterly disappointed about that. She's still pushed aside. But another opportunity comes. Read the next verse. Verse 33. "And she conceived again and bare a son, and she said, Because Yahweh hath heard that I was not preferred, he hath therefore given me this son also. So she called his name Simeon." Now Simeon means hearing. Leah's declaration that despite Jacob's failure to respond to the birth of Reuben, nevertheless God got involved again. He'd heard her cry for help. You imagine her prayers, can't you? He'd heard her cry for help. Perhaps Jacob might wake up. He might hear also. Sorry, Leah. Sorry. It doesn't happen. Read the next verse. Verse 34. "And she conceived again and bare a son, and said, Now this time will my husband be joined unto me, because I have borne him 3 sons. Therefore his name was called Levi." Now Levi means joined. So there's a hopeful expression by Leah here that, well, after 3 sons, come on, please, get your act together, Jacob. 3 sons. Surely you must see what God's doing here. But she doesn't mention God here. There is no mention of God in the verse that deals with the birth of Levi. So she has hope that this would convince Jacob to turn to her, but it doesn't happen. So where does she go next? Well, the final verse of Genesis 29 says this. "And she conceived again and bare a son, and she said, Now will I praise Yahweh. Therefore she called his name Judah." You know what this verse doesn't contain? It makes no mention of Jacob. He is not there in that verse. In the naming of Judah, she names him for one reason. She's going to praise Yahweh. She's given birth to 4 sons. Jacob continues on his merry way, preferring Rachel, even though she's barren, preferring her above Leah, not recognising the hand of God in her life and in his. He goes on his merry way, and she puts her trust in God alone. That's how the name Judah came into existence. Praise for Yahweh alone, leaving man out of the picture. He's left out. And that's why it then says at the end of verse 35, she left bearing. Why do you think she left bearing? Well, she didn't bother to try and intrude upon the relationship between Jacob and Rachel. She didn't say, well, it's my turn. She'd been doing that before. It's my turn, isn't it? Give me a fair go. I'm a wife too, all right? She just says now, I'm done. I'm done with this. I'm out of the game. I've got 4 sons. I'm going to praise Yahweh. I'll put absolutely no confidence in man whatsoever. She's finished. That's why she left bearing, brothers and sisters. No access to Jacob. But then, of course, things happen, don't they? Things happen to stir up the pot, and the wrestling gets worse. Because what happens in verse 1 of chapter 30 is that Rachel comes and makes a ridiculous request of Jacob. Look at it, verse 1. When Rachel saw that she bare Jacob no children, Rachel envied her sister. Now, envy, of course, is a good Christadelphian quality, isn't it? We all practice envy, don't we? Well, of course we don't. Christadelphians are not envious. They're grateful. We're not envious, are we, Brother Bill? Of course not. No. So you see why I highlight that? There's wrong things happening here. And so Rachel says to Jacob, she envies her sister and said unto Jacob, give me children, else I die. And Jacob has been hit between the eyes with a 4B2. And he says, huh? Am I God? That I can produce children for you? Come on, please. Now he's starting to realise, isn't he? He's starting to realise where this is all going to lead. Jacob's anger was kindled in verse 2 against Rachel's. First time, probably. And he said, am I in God's stead, who hath withheld from thee the fruit of the womb? It's God's work. Okay? So there's a little bit of progress being made here. So Rachel's got a solution. Most women have got solutions for this sort of thing. So she's got a solution. Her solution is to bring along Bilhah, her handmaid, and give Jacob a third wife, or just what he needs. Hey, so bring a third wife along, and she'll bear children on my knees, and they're just like my children. Very unsatisfactory, I would have thought, but that's her plan. And so Bilhah has 2 children. They're named appropriately for the reason that they were brought forth. So what does Leah do? Well, verse 9 tells us what Leah does in chapter 30. It says, when Leah saw that she had left bearing, she took Zilpah her maid and gave her Jacob to wife. So she decides that she's going to get into the act as well. So she gives Zilpah, her maid, to Jacob as a 4th wife. And 2 more boys are born. And then we come to the incident of the mandrakes. This is where it gets a bit grubby, doesn't it? It gets a bit grubby here. Because we read in verse 14, and Reuben went in the days of wheat harvest and found mandrakes in the field and brought them unto his mother Leah. Then Rachel said to Leah, I want them. Give me the mandrakes. And she said unto her, is it a small matter that thou hast taken my husband? And wouldest thou take away my son's mandrakes also? And Rachel said, look, I'll do a trade. I'll do a deal. She had rock solid control of the marital bed. She controlled it. When Jacob came in from the field, she controlled what he did. This is right. When he comes back tonight, he's yours, as long as I get the mandrakes. Now, Unger in his Bible dictionary says this about mandrakes. Mandrakes were the apples of the mandragora, a herb if you're in this country, a herb resembling the belladonna, with a root like a carrot, having white and reddish blossoms of a sweet smell. We read about them in the Song of Solomon, chapter 7 and verse 13. And with yellow odoriferous apples, which ripen from May to July in the Middle East, to these, Oriental superstition attributes still a sexual power. Not so much an aphrodisiac, but as an aid to ensure conception. So they used to believe that if you ate mandrakes, a little bit like the health industry today, the natural health industry, eat this, it will solve your problems. I used to think that if you ate these apples of the mandrake, or the mandragora tree, that it could help conception. So Rachel says, ha, there's my answer. All right? So she's going to grab onto a natural health cure to solve the problem that God brought into her life. He kept her barren. Her problem's not going to be solved by mandrakes. It's going to be solved by prayer. And later on we read about that, don't we? When she does finally realise that she needs to take this matter to God, not say to Jacob, give me children else I die, I'll commit suicide. All right? She takes the matter to God. Have a look at verse 22 of Genesis 30. And God remembered Rachel, and God hearkened to her. Hearkened to her? Yes, she's gone to him over this matter. And when you go to the Father, he'll answer. He answers. She did this in faith. He answers. God hearkened to her, and he opened her womb, and she conceived, and she brings forth, of course, Joseph. And then says, well, that's one. Now for number two. All right? Not for, she didn't ask for God for number two, but now for number two. Well, number two was to see her end. Yeah. She was to give birth, but in the process, she was going to die. Give me children, else I die. And that's exactly what happened to her when Benjamin was born. So there's the really grubby period of this fractious family, where Jacob's being traded like a horse, by his wives. And of course we know what happens. He comes in the record of verse 16, Jacob came out of the field in the evening, Leah comes out, demands his presence. God hearkens in verse 17 unto Leah. She conceives, brings forth a fifth, and then finally a sixth son is born to her. And then Dinah comes along afterwards. So you get the idea, brothers and sisters, of what's happening in this family. I want to show you a timeline of Leah's troubles. So here's a chart, here's a timeline. Let's just step back to the beginning. This is where Jacob receives 2 wives in a week. So he gets Leah by deception. A week later, he takes Rachel. He's already worked 7 years. He's now got to work another 7 years. So this is the 7 years he's got to work for Leah. Then, by this time, he has 4 sons. All right. By the time he's done his 7 years, he's got 4 sons via Leah, because she begins to bring forth sons almost immediately. All right. So let's just follow this timeline of her troubles. By the time we get to him leaving Haran, he has 11 sons and 1 daughter on leaving Haran, 33 years after his marriage. That's right, isn't it? 64. Some mathematicians in the room. He receives 2 wives. Within 1 week he's aged 64. 33 years later he's aged 97. He leaves to come back to the land. Okay? He's got 6 sons from Dinah at that point. Rachel dies around about the time that Jacob's 101. A few years later. Jacob buries Isaac when Jacob, was 120 years of age. And we know that he went to Egypt when he was 130. So sometime between the burial of Isaac when Jacob was 120 and when he was 130, he went to Egypt. Sometime in that 10-year period, he buries Leah in the cave of Machpelah. So what does this all mean? What it means is this: that from this point here to somewhere in this point here, and we don't know exactly when, probably not that long after Rachel dies, from this point here to somewhere there, Jacob keeps Leah out of the picture. She's not preferred. She's pushed aside. She's treated like a chattel. She's wrestling with her sister day after day after day until Rachel's no longer there to wrestle with. What a life that is. So the approximate period of Leah's acceptance by Jacob can be no longer than somewhere between 15 and 20 years. Her heartache goes on for nearly 50. nearly 50 years of heartache for Leah. I want to talk to you about what God does with this woman. I want to show you what faithfulness and loyalty can achieve in the end if, like Leah, you maintain your faith. She wasn't perfect. She went into the trading deal over mandrake. She wasn't perfect. But God brings her through. This is a woman of faith under trial, as we're going to see. So let's have a look and see what happens. I want to show you three things that happens to Leah. Firstly, Genesis 49. It's a few chapters along in our Bible. Genesis 49 is where Jacob blesses his sons. A wonderful section of Scripture, by the way. It's a curious piece of Scripture, but it's a wonderful piece of Scripture when you dig down into it. It's prophecies of the latter days in which the work of God is prominent in Christ. Now, this is the order of the birth of the sons of Jacob. So here's the order of their birth. Reuben, Simeon, Levi, all sons of Leah. We looked at them. Then came Dan from Bilhah, Naphtali from Bilhah, that's Rachel's maid. And we got Gad from Zilpah, Leah's maid. Then Asher from Zilpah. Then Leah chimes in again and has two more, Issachar and Zebulun. And then we've got Joseph, born because Rachel requested from God and he intervenes. And then finally, of course, in the land, Benjamin is born. Now that's the order of their birth. Now, if you ever look at Genesis 49, you're going to read things like this in the commentary. I mean, Christadelphian commentaries. You're going to read that Jacob blessed his sons in the order of his birth. Wrong. Quite wrong. He did not bless his sons in the order of their birth. You know what he puts first? In the order of the blessing? He puts the 6 sons of Leah up front. That's what he does. The 6 sons of Leah come first in the blessing. So he pushes Dan, number 5, out of his 5th position and shoves him down to 7. He takes Naphtali, 6th position, and shoves him down to number 10 in the order of blessing. Why did he do that? You think, why did he do that? He's saying something, isn't he? He's days away from dying. A day or two away from dying. He's just done the greatest act of faith in his life. He's just blessed Joseph's sons, crossing his hands, remember? Genesis 48. That he brings his boys in and delivers a blessing. Not that Reuben, Simeon and Levi would have thought that what they got was a blessing. But he delivers a blessing in the order which includes the 6 sons of Leah up front. What he's saying? I could have had all 12 of these from Leah. That's what he's saying. If I just listen, if I believe the promise that I will not forsake you nor leave you, if I just believed it, could have had all 12 from my God-given wife, Leah. He's telling his sons that. How do you reckon you would have felt if you were Dan, number 5? All right? Kicked down the road. You know, because they would have been there in the order of their ages, wouldn't they? Standing before Jacob. Right, next, Reuben, next, Levi, Simeon, next, Levi, next, Judah. Get down to Dan. He says, no, you stand there. You go down to number 7. Get to Naphtali, number 6. No, you go to number 10. Hey? What's that about, Dad? Well, it was important because Jacob was saying something. Now, that's the first thing that we notice. Then there's another one. I want you to come to Ezekiel chapter 48. Ezekiel chapter 48. Now, Ezekiel 48 verses 15 and 17 specify that part of the holy oblation that was to be devoted to the city of Yahweh Shema. And have a look at verses 31 to 35 of Ezekiel 48. Verse 31 says, well, we'll just step back to verse 30. And these are the goings out of the city on the north side, 4,500 measures. Then it spells out the gates in verses 31 to 34. And it says in verse 35, It was round about 18,000 measures, and the name of the city from that day shall be, the Lord is there. Now, some people think that this is a reference to the temple. No, it's not. This is actually here in verses 30 to 35 of Ezekiel 48. It's a reference to Yahweh Shema. That's what the margin will tell you for the phrase, the Lord is there. You know what Yahweh Shema means? Literally it means, from thence unto Yahweh. Brother Sully says the meaning is Yahweh thither, or to Yahweh from this place. Now Yahweh Shema is a 10 square mile, or 16 square kilometres, 10 square mile residential city. It's designed for the worshippers who come to the land. That's where they're going to stay while they're there in the land, and they'll make their journeys up to the temple. Now the temple is about 20 miles away from Yahweh Shema. The temple's up here. It's on the southern boundary of the holy portion, the sons of Zadok. Yahweh Shema is in what's called the profane, or the ordinary area of the holy oblation. So it's down here, about 20 miles away from the temple. So that's the subject matter here. And this residential city has gates. It's got 12 gates. And they're described for us in verses 31 to 34. Okay? You with me? Well, this is the configuration of the gates. Alright? This is the configuration of the gates. The gates to the west, Naphtali, Asher, Gad, are out to the fields. These gates will be used not by the worshippers, but by the Levites and others who go out to tend the fields. And in those fields they'll have cattle, they'll grow crops, because they're going to provide for mortal worshippers. You know, so they've got to bring food in. They bring them in through the gates of Naphtali, Asher and Gad. They'll also do the same in the gates of Joseph, Benjamin and Dan on the east. Another thing will be done on the east. The Levites will actually go and they'll prepare salt from the marshes at the base of what once was the Dead Sea. Salt deposits will be left there because the Levites got to prepare that to be taken up to the temple to be offered with the sacrifices. So these are the gates of the workmen. You have workmen's sort of entrances in factories and buildings and that kind of thing. Of course you do. So the main entrances are where the worshippers arrive to come to worship. They come through these southern gates because they come up from down from the area of the Red Sea. They come up here and they come through these gates. They are housed in Yahweh Shema. Then when their time comes to go to the temple to worship, they go through these gates in the north, Levi, Judah and Reuben. When they come back from their worship, they come back through the gates in the north, and when they finally go home, they go through the gates in the south. Got a picture? Well, guess what? The gates of the north and the south are all sons of Leah. All sons of Leah. The gates on the east, Joseph, Benjamin, sons of Rachel, Dan, son of Bilhah. On the west, Gad, Asher, sons of Zilpah, Naphtali, Bilhah. They're like the lower order. They're the people who do the hard work. They're the ones who are out in the field, see? But when you come to this place to worship Yahweh, and when you go through the north gate and you come back from the temple through the north gate and then go home from the south, you are passing through the gates that belong to the sons of Leah. You reckon she won't know that in the kingdom age? And that will go on for 1,000 years. And the world will be reminded that there is a reward for faithful service and loyalty under trial. That's what they'll be reminded of. She won't miss that one. You can be assured of that. And there's a third thing we need to consider. You come to Genesis chapter 49. Genesis chapter 49, and we read in verse 29. Jacob charged them and said unto his sons, I am to be gathered unto my people. Bury me with my fathers in the cave that is in the field of Ephron the Hittite, in the cave that is in the field of Machpelah, which is before Mamre, in the land of Canaan, which Abraham bought with the field of Ephron the Hittite for a possession of a burying place. Now, Jacob is showing his faith, of course. He wants to be buried alongside of the patriarchs, Abraham and Sarah and Isaac and Rebekah. Yeah, Machpelah means to be folded together. So he wants to be with the patriarchs who are awaiting the resurrection, so that when he wakes up at the resurrection, he'll be standing beside Abraham and Sarah and Isaac and Rebekah. That's where he wants to be. So take me out of Egypt and bury me up there, he says, which is what they did. But then look at verse 31. There they buried Abraham and Sarah, his wife. Why does he say that, do you think? Well, Abraham had 3 wives, didn't he? Abraham had Sarah, Hagar, and Keturah. He says, there they buried Abraham and Sarah, his wife. The other 2 left out. Read on. There they buried Isaac and Rebekah, his wife. Well, he only had 1 wife, didn't he? And why has he got to say his wife? Thought about that? Then he says this. And there I buried Leah. He does not need to say my wife, because it's palpably obvious to his sons and to everyone else that he's saying, you don't dare bury me anywhere but there beside Leah. That's where I want to be. She's my God-given wife. I didn't understand that 60 years ago, but I know it now. So put me alongside of my God-given wife. And when Leah wakes up at the resurrection, you're not going to know where she was buried, is she? But when she wakes up at the resurrection, it won't be like that morning in Genesis 29 when they wake up and says, who are you? I didn't marry you, I don't want to marry you. When Jacob and Leah wake up at the resurrection, not only will they have the company of Abraham and Sarah and Isaac and Rebekah, that's not bad company, is it? They'll have another one. Caleb, the son of Jephunneh, buried beside them too. So there's going to be quite a band there, quite a group. He will have his God-given wife beside him, and she will look him in the eyes and receive a consolation that she didn't get for at least 50 years of her stricken, fractious, troubled life. Yeah, there's a lesson in that, brothers and sisters. There is a reward for faithfulness and loyalty under severe and enduring trials. Well, let's move on from Leah. Let's just summarise what we've said in our studies today and move on to Jacob. Essentially got an allegory of 2 women here, haven't we? Rachel, we saw, is clearly a type of natural Israel, and Leah, we're going to see, as the opposite. Both of her sons were a type of Christ. We know that from Micah chapter 5, which we read. And it had to be that way, didn't it? God was going to bring forth his son, born of a woman, made under the law. He had to come from natural Israel in the line of David. That was required by prophecy. So it had to happen. Christ had to come from natural Israel. But Leah represents spiritual Israel. This is the group that you and I belong to, brothers and sisters. The nation that brings forth the fruits thereof, Christ could say in Matthew 21 verse 43. Now I'm not going to take you back to those passages that you can see, but if I did, we could demonstrate that we were there in the language of Isaiah 65 verse 1. We are the people whom God has called out of the darkness of the Gentiles to be part of the bride of Christ. We belong to spiritual Israel. And of course Leah rests with the patriarchs in Machpelah, finally accepted as Jacob's true wife. I want to finish our studies today in Genesis 30 at the end of the chapter. So if we come back to Genesis 30, we're going to talk about Jacob's rods. Now you all know the story, don't you? About how he ends up working for another 6 years for Laban. Because Laban says, look, listen, I see you're getting a little bit towy there, you want to go home. And he thinks he's going to lose Jacob's services, you see, so He wants to put him to work again. But when he offers him a job, Jacob says, well, I don't want anything at all except the coloured animals in your flock. I'll take whatever comes out coloured. So you know the story, don't you? Genesis chapter 30. Let's just have a look at it. We're going to come back to this verse later on. But look, have a look at verse 26. This is after the birth of Joseph. Verse 26 of Genesis 30 says, "Give me my wives and my children for whom I have served thee, and let me go, says Jacob to Laban. Thou knowest my service which I've done thee." Laban says, well, hang on, don't go. I've learned my experience that I've been blessed because you've been here, Jacob. So he said, well, appoint me thy wages, and I will give it. And Jacob says to him in verse 29, "Thou knowest how I have served thee, and how thy cattle was with me. You didn't have much when I came, Laban, did you? But you got a lot now because God's blessed it. He's increased it," he tells him in verse 30. "But I'm going to provide for my own." So he says in verse 30, well, what do you want? And Jacob says, "You will not give me anything." Verse 31. "I'll just take the coloured in your flock." All right? So what do you reckon Laban would do? What do you reckon Laban would do as a result of this? Well, I'll show you what he does. You just come down to verse 32. It says, this is Jacob talking, "I will pass through all thy flock today, removing from thence all the speckled and the spotted cattle, and all the brown among the sheep, and the spotted and the speckled among the goats. Of such shall be my hire." You reckon Jacob gets to do that? No. Cast your eye down to verse 34 onwards. "And Laban said, Behold, I would it might be according to thy word." What a deal that is. Ho, ho. Won't do much better than this. You can see him, his mind's like a cash register, isn't it? You can see his eyes going, wow, the opportunities here are fabulous. So what does he do? Look what Laban does. Verse 35. "And he removed that day." Now you could read that. You could read that as Jacob removed that day. Wrong. The he in this verse, verse 35, is Laban. And Laban removed that. I'll give you the proof. Laban removed that day the he-goats that were ring-straked and spotted, and the she-goats that were speckled and spotted. So he goes through the flocks, he takes out all the coloured animals, and what does he do with them? Look at end of verse 35. "And he gave them into the hand of his sons, and he set 3 days' journey betwixt himself and Jacob." So it's Laban. It's Laban that removes the colours. So you see, Jacob starts with zilch. He was going to start by taking all the colours out of the flock. That would be his starting stock, see? Oh, no. Laban gets all them. And he puts them with his sons. And there's 3 days' journey, so there can be no connection between the flocks, and therefore no coloured animal can breed with a white animal. All right? So what hope have you got? What hope have you got? None! Except for throwbacks. So that's the position that Jacob finds himself in. He's been deceived again. He's going to be deceived 10 more times because Laban's going to change his wages 10 times in 6 years. So this final 6 years he's labouring, his wages are changed 10 times. How would you feel about that, brethren, if your boss changed your wages 10 times in 6 years and every time it went down? Eh? That's what happened. Well, here we've got the story. So what does he do? Look at verse 37. "And Jacob took him rods of green poplar and of hazel and chestnut tree, and peeled white strakes in them, and made the white appear which was in the rods." Sounds like a pretty technical operation, doesn't it? Takes out a penknife and he carves around, like you've seen a barber's pole, a bit like that, and so he cuts it around and he strips it off, and you've got bark and you've got the white of the branch behind it. Verse 38 says, "And he set the rods which he had peeled before the flocks in the gutters in the watering troughs when the flocks came to drink, that they should conceive when they came to drink, and the flocks conceived before the rods and brought forth cattle, ring-straked and speckled and spotted. All right? So is it Jacob's rods? No. We're going to find out it was not Jacob's rods at all that did this. So what are these trees? We've got a green poplar, some think it's the storax, a young storax, says Rotherham, grows to about 20 feet high. Its leaves are white on the lower surface and it bears a wealth of white blossoms. This is described as a white tree. Laban actually means whitish. It comes from the same root as this tree, the libna. All right? So it's a very similar word to Laban in the Hebrew. The hazelnut tree is a nut tree, perhaps the almond tree, we don't know. The chestnut tree, the plane tree, from its smooth bark, which is scratched, shows white. Grows to about 30 metres, it's 60 odd feet, with a base 3 metres in diameter, so it's a pretty big tree, that one. And when the bark is shed, the white smooth trunk is revealed. So this is the kind of trees he took, and he got out his penknife and he cut them up and tried to make this like barber's rod. So this was Jacob's device. It was not Syrian magic. He didn't go to the Syrians to find this out, but it was based upon contemporary practices of the day. There was this thought that if you did this, it could have an impact upon what came out from the breeding cycle. That's what they thought. But it was Jacob's contrivance. God didn't tell him to do this, did he? It was Jacob's, and this is the great lesson we've got to learn, brothers and sisters. We've all got a way, haven't we? When we're confronted with a problem, he had a problem, we usually have a way. Oh, I can handle that one. Don't worry, I've got a control. I can do that. That's the first thing we think about. Rarely do we take the matter to God first. That was one of Jacob's problems. And I'm going to show you in his distress in Genesis 32 that he acts and then prays. He should pray and then act. But we're all like him to a certain extent. When you're confronted with an issue or a problem, what do you do first? You answer yourself. You answer before God. What do you do first? You usually say, well, I can do this. I can get out of it. I can do this. And then you go to God and say, well, can you help me? You should go to God straight away. And maybe what comes into your mind is not what you thought was the right thing to do. Maybe God gets involved. That's the difference. Now, Keel and Dalis say this artifice was founded upon a fact frequently noticed, particularly in the case of sheep, that whatever fixes their attention in copulation is marked upon the young. I'm not sure that modern science would support that, but that's what was thought at the time. But you see, Genesis 31, verses 7 to 13, gives us the answer. So when you just cast your eye across to Genesis 31, verse 7, and this is Jacob talking to Rachel and Leah in the field. He says, your father hath deceived me and changed my wages 10 times in the 6 years I served him for the cattle. But God suffered him not to hurt me. If he said thus, and this is how the wages were changed in verse 8 of chapter 31, the speckled shall be thy wages, then all the cattle bear speckled. And if he said thus, the ring-straked shall be thy hire, then bear all the cattle ring-straked. Thus God hath taken away the cattle of your father and given them to me. So let me tell you the story of what happened. Jacob's device did not work. It was God who intervened on his behalf. So this is what happened. His wages had changed 10 times in 6 years until Jacob realises that God is involved. Now there were 2 breeding cycles every year. So if you're serving for 6 years, you've got 12 breeding cycles, all right? 12 in that 6 years. Well, it took Laban a little while to wake up what was happening. But when he woke up and realised what was happening, every time he came along, he would change Jacob's wages. Because this is what would happen. Jacob would put the rods in there faithfully every time there was a breeding cycle going on. And he'd put the rods in there and he'd watch the rams and come along and do their job. Right? And then they would bring out ring straight. Because that's what Laban had said him. See, you can have the ring straight. But then Laban comes along and says, oh, they're all ring straight. Okay, well this time you can have the spotted and I'll keep the ring straight. So next breeding cycle, Jacob puts his rods in there, all come out spotted. Laban comes along and says, oh, you can have the brown and I'll have the ring straight and the spotted. Next breeding cycle, he puts the rods there and they're all brown. And it went on like that 10 times over 5.5 years. That went on. Every breeding cycle was changed. In the end, Jacob comes to the realisation that it was not his rods that were doing it. I mean, that'd be magic, wouldn't it? Every time that Laban nominates something, you plonk the rods, the same rods in front of the sheep, you get a different result. That'd be magic. And in the end, Jacob realises it's got nothing to do with his rods. He gets hold of these silly rods and chucks them out. Calls out his wives and says, God hath taken away the cattle of your father and given them to me. And he tells the story. You have a look at verse 10 of chapter 31. Came to pass at the time that the cattle conceived that I lifted up mine eyes and saw in a dream, and behold, the rams which leaped upon the cattle were ring-straked and speckled and grizzled. Whatever Laban nominated, that was the colour on that particular occasion. It changed every time, but whatever he nominated is what he got. So he knew. He says in verse 11, and the angel of God spake unto me in a dream and said, you can go home, Jacob. You can go home. And we'll talk about that a little bit later on in our studies. So this is what happens here. I want to finish on this note about Laban. You know, Paul says that the love of money is the root of all evil. He doesn't say money is the root of all evil. The love of money. And nobody loved money more than Laban. Mine was like a cash register. It was all about making more money. Everything he did, deception, was all about making more money. And we know people like that, don't we? Hopefully not Christadelphians, but we know people like that. So this is how he starts out. But you see a changing attitude. You look at Genesis 30 verse 27. And let's just analyse that verse 27. And Laban said unto him, I pray thee, if I have found favour in thine eyes, tarry, for I have learned by experience. Now, that phrase, learned by experience, is just the one Hebrew word. Nakash means to practice divination, to divine, to learn by experience, diligently observe, but it's got a connection. It's the root of the word serpent. You know, Nakash, the word, the serpent in the Old Testament. I have learned by experience. Young Literal translates it, I have observed diligently. Can you imagine? Just get a picture in your mind. You see Laban's beady little eyes. There's a lot of fixation on money. Everything he does, he's looking, how can I make a dollar out of that? See? The love of money. You can see his beady eyes like a serpent. You know, he's up. Oh, look at that. I've been blessed by God. Because Jacob's here, see? He understands where this is coming from. He goes on to say, I've learned by experience that Yahweh hath blessed me for thy sake. So he says, appoint me thy wages. But come to chapter 31, verses 1 and 2. And he, Jacob, heard the words of Laban's son, saying, Jacob hath taken away all that was our father's. A bit like their father, aren't they? And of that which was our father's hath he gotten all this glory. And Jacob beheld the countenance of Laban, and behold, it was not toward him as before. Young Literal says, because that word countenance there is face, Young Literal says, and Jacob seeth the face of Laban, and lo, it was not with him as heretofore. There's been a shift. A major shift in the attitude of Laban towards Jacob. He could make profit out of him, but now he knows. Because God's got involved, now he knows he's going to lose everything if he doesn't do something about this. And of course God chimes in and says to Jacob, now you've learnt not to deceive. Now you've learnt to trust in me. Now you've thrown away your own devices. You can go home. I will release you from the hand of this inveterate deceiver. Yes, brothers and sisters, Peter says in 1 Peter 5 that after ye have suffered a while, alright, then he'll give you peace. The reason you're suffering is because God is dealing with the Jacob in all of us.